Well, good evening. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization. I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Iowa City Book Festival. We have moved fully online for this year's fest, so we appreciate you joining us from wherever you may be. All of our festival events are archived, so if you missed anything along the way, you can find links to past events at iowacitofliterature.org or iowacitybookfestival.org to catch up. The festival is sponsored by the University of Iowa, the City of Iowa City, the Iowa Arts Council, and Iowa Public Radio. Tonight we're pleased to welcome author Hope Edelman. She will discuss her new book, The Aftergrief, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss. Edelman is the author of 8 nonfiction books, including the bestsellers Motherless Daughters and Motherless Mothers, and the memoir, The Possibility of Everything. Her work has received a New York Times Notable Book of the Year designation and a Pushcart Prize for creative nonfiction. The recipient of the 2020 Community Educator Award from the Association for Death Education and Counseling, she is also certified as a Martha Beck Certified Life Coach and facilitates Motherless Daughters retreats and workshops all over the world. She lives and works in Los Angeles and Iowa City. Edelman will be joined tonight by her friend Kelly Carlin. Carlin is an author, performer, podcast and radio host, and life coach. In 2015, her best-selling memoir, A Carlin Home Companion, Growing Up with George, was published by St. Martin's Press. In 2017, she retired her solo show of the same name and turned her focus to her other passion, empowering women through her coaching program, Women on the Verge. You can hear her on her popular podcast, Waking from the American Dream, and her SiriusXM show, The Kelly Carlin Show. If you have questions at any point during our program, please use the Ask a Question function at the bottom of your screen. It's an icon with a question mark on it for those on devices. The green Buy the Book/Donate button will take you to a page with information about how to purchase Edelman's book from our friends and co-presenters at Prairie Lights Books, as well as details about how to support the City of Literature so we can continue to present free events like the Book Festival. And now I would like to welcome Hope Edelman and Kelly Carlin to the Iowa City Book Festival.
Hi, Kel.
Hey, Hope. Thank you, John, for the introduction. And thank you, Hope.
Prairie Lights.
Yeah, totally.
It's breaking my heart not to be there in person. I know, it's this is as closest as you've gotten to Iowa City, Kelly?
Yeah, pretty much. But would love to come.
Hello, everybody. I know I've got some friends and former students here tonight, but we can't see you and we can't see the names. But if you type in the chat box and say hello, we'll see your name, so I'll know who's here. And we'd love to know also where you're calling in from, if you're in Iowa City, if you're local, or if you're calling in from far and wide.
Yes, and there's an Ask a Question button down there, so we will be getting to questions. So whether you have a question now or a question while we're talking, please feel free. This is going to be a rambling, very down-to-earth, real conversation about Hope and her book and her writing and grief. So we're just going to jump in, and we want you to be a part of that conversation here. So thank you, Hope, for having me. Really thrilled to be here and be a part of this. And congratulations on the book.
Thank you. It's been out a week and a half.
Yeah. And I know, because I've been friends with you for the last few years, how challenging it's been.
It took 4 years to write. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Well, you've been there for all 4 of those years, Kelly. You've heard me bemoaning the process, and you know how many iterations it went through before it landed in the final one.
Yeah. And so I thought it'd be nice to kind of start with the creative part of it, the writing process part, and then we'll jump into the juicy content of it, because I know there's a lot of probably writers here who are also in the audience today.
Yes,
and we are at a book festival, and people like to talk about writing, and I'm a writer too, so I'm fascinated by this. So I did want to know about, so it took 4 years. I know there was a lot of iterations, but I'm so curious if there was like an original kernel or the original inspiration that you stayed connected to the whole time, and is it still present in the book?
That's such a good question. Well, I wrote the proposal in the summer of 2016. So hold on to that thought. July, August 2016. Maybe it was a little earlier, actually. It was a little earlier. And I'll tell you why, because Iowa City factors into the story. It's probably more like June. And I wanted to write a book about my experience with grief over the long term. So the kernel there was, yes, through my work with Motherless Daughters and the people who love them, I have spent a lot of time, more than 20 years now, hearing stories from people who are 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years beyond a major loss. And in the retreats that I've been leading for 4 years, I was hearing quite a lot about how that loss was still showing up for them. So that was the kernel I wanted to start with. I also wanted to talk about how what we think of as grief, especially over the long term, is not purely a painful and negative experience, that it does start shading into what I call the missing elements of grief, the ones that we don't talk about very much, the ones that aren't pathologized, like appreciation and gratitude and resilience and hope and faith and insight and humility. All of those that do come if you just can wait it out long enough. They will start arriving, often on their own and sometimes through willful effort. So yes. So I originally started, and the book sold while I was in Iowa City. Literally, I woke up in my bed. I have a house on Davenport Street that I spend summers in. I woke up in my bed to an email from my literary agent telling me that Ballantine had made this really great offer, what's called a preempt, and we took it. So then I started doing research, and then in November of 2016, we all know what happened. And everything changed for me at that time in the way that I saw grief and bereavement, because I was observing online a significant portion of this country having a response that looked to me like grief. Mm-hmm. And a much smaller proportion, but a very vocal one, saying, "You lost, get over it." And I thought, ooh, where did a message like that come from? Like, where did that lack of empathy or that inability to acknowledge, that people are expressing themselves and talking about their hurt and their suffering? And I started thinking about messages, the messages that we get about grief. And so the book went into another iteration. The final iteration, the one that shows up in this one now, came about less than a year ago. So it took me, I'm not kidding you, 3.5 years to write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite the first 120 pages of this book. Wow. And then I wrote the next 240 pages in about 5 months. And that was all during the pandemic. So, I was sitting at my dining room table every day, and I just woke up every morning, made my coffee, and started writing for 5 months. That's how I wrote the book.
Well, I think that your story about writing your book really shows how our idea of things don't go as planned, certainly,
Yeah, the best way
but really also like how if something is meant to be, especially a creative project, if something is meant to be, it's going to find its way out into the world, and it's going to birth itself how it's going to birth itself.
Yeah.
And the timing of it too. I mean, really, like it's right here now. And we need it, really.
Who knew, Kelly? No, really, I was 2 years past deadline, and it was critical. It was like I was afraid that my contract might get canceled. Now, my literary agent, she was the keeper of the faith. She said, this book will take as long as it takes. This is a really important book. You can't rush it. It will happen when it happens. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, dear God, like I'm out of money. I have to finish this book so my daughter and I can get through the year, because I was newly separated. And so I just nose to the grindstone every day, day after day, to get it out. And then it came out, and I was writing it during a pandemic, and then there was collective grief, right? So exactly, who knew? I mean, I don't want to say good timing for me, because it's terrible timing for everybody, but it was synchronicitous, is that a word? It was a good synchronicity for the book, but it's terrible for all of us. Yeah.
And I really do think it is a topic that, well, you've been in this topic for so long, but as we know, and you and I have talked about this with other people, it's not a topic that, Americans like to talk about. or anyone. And so I want to dig into it a little bit and into some of the wider topics in the book, because one of the first things you do in the book is you walk us through our relationship with grief and how we've learned, like, what the set traditions are and why we have attitudes towards it, and kind of answer the question of why do people say, oh, just move on, get over it.
Yeah.
Kind of
there's a whole historical basis for it. And when you're saying we, when we say we, we're talking mainly about Western white Protestant dominated culture.
100%. Yes, because so many cultures have, and that's something you talk about. So I'd love to like unpack that a little bit about what you learned about the history on the Western culture side, and how different cultures sit with and work with grief.
Right. Well, when I wrote Motherless Daughters, which first came out in '94 and then has been updated twice, most recently in 2014, I was really I was interviewing women of all different backgrounds, ages, races, ethnicities, religion, geography. And I was looking for the common denominators and emphasizing those, because these women had felt so alone and so marginalized. I was looking for, underneath all of the demographic, differences and stratification, what was the lava underneath that was all the same. But in writing this book, I took a really different approach. And I thought, well, I think we need to honor the differences now too. And talk about how grief is culturally relative. But that also is, has a lot to do with my own intellectual development and personal politics. But grief is very culturally relative. So what I learned, that white Western culture really sucks at handling grief. We really suck at it. And we didn't used to. We didn't always. I mean, kind of think about in the 19th century, Victorian mourning rituals, they were very elaborate. And, they were, wow. They affected the way people dressed. They affected the social codes. They affected the way we decorated our houses. There was a cultural and a social sanction for people who were in mourning, and they were treated special and different and more carefully, like they were fragile, because you could go out in the street and you would know who was in mourning by what they were wearing. The men had black armbands. The women had very specific mourning dress. There was a book that told you, how long you were in a high mourning and low mourning, whether you lost a spouse or a child or a first cousin or a mother-in-law. And it was an ordeal, and it filtered over into the US, not to the same extent, but this was all a result of Queen Victoria. And then in the 19-teens in America, 4 things happened and mourning behavior changed for the next 100 years. And that's where we are right now. But those 4 things in a nutshell, and chapter 1 is all about this, are World War I, where large mass casualties occurred because it was a technological war. People died far from home for the first time. I mean, masses of people died in the Civil War, but usually the body could be transported to the family for burial. Here, people were dying overseas, and they were being buried where they fell. So funerals got all messed up because people did not have bodies to bury to honor their dead in a way that they were used to. Then Sigmund Freud published the paper, Mourning and Melancholia, in 1917. So the influence of psychoanalysts, which said, mourning is not really like a collective social process, because it had always been communal. Everyone came together to mourn the passing of one of their own. But the psychoanalysts said, oh, no, it's like an interior, mysterious process. Like they were kind of still in the romantic era, but with one foot in modernism, because they said, and it's progressive and linear. Here are the steps that you go through, like your psyche goes through to let go of someone you love. And, the psychoanalysts took that and ran with it and said, we have to let go of the people that we love. We have to take back that attachment and attach to somebody else and relinquish our ties. And that did such damage to a whole 100 years of mourners. Anyway, the third thing, and this is really relevant, was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 19, because right on the heels of World War I, people could not follow their mourning rituals because they would have been in mourning, and mourning would have overlapped. And there were families that had multiple people dying all at once with the flu pandemic. And people were afraid to go to funerals. So funerals became smaller, mourning periods contracted, a lot of rituals were lost. And the feminist movement was the fourth, the women's suffrage movement, because women had been mostly responsible for maintaining all of those rituals. And they were like, hey, this is not fair that we have to do all this work. Men get to wear a black armband, they can go back to work, but we're still here, covering the mirrors and wearing the dark clothing for a year or two. So, and then behavior started changing. And And we started moving into the modern era, which was all about productivity and efficiency and getting people back to work and moving things forward, on an assembly line. And that's when we started. And that led us right into the 5 stages of grief in the late 1960s with Kubler-Ross's book. And
which I loved when you wrote about that, because it reminded me, which I knew, but I had forgotten, that she was writing about the stages that people were going through who were dying.
Yeah, it was about her. No, it was the stages of dying. It was her.
Yes, and it wasn't the other way around. And then it got
wasn't it supposed to be about the survivors? Got co-opted in a completely different direction. Yeah. That's why it's always been an ill-fitting model.
Totally, absolutely. And of course, anyone who's had a major loss, it's there's nothing linear about it.
No, it's cyclical. It's it's like a contraction and expansion model. That's the one that I use in the book. I went looking for some kind of model for long-term bereavement because I couldn't find it. First of all, there was no name for it either. Long-term bereavement. I mean, that doesn't really work. So that's how I came up with the aftergrief, because we didn't have a vocabulary to even talk about what loss turns into, how we carry it forward a decade later, 2 decades later, 3, 4 decades later. So I had to create a language for it, but I couldn't find a model either. So, I developed one. It's called the Rings of Grief. But the models that were out there were mostly for how to get through like that first acute period, the first year or two. Yeah. And someone's saying in the chat, many of us have had collective losses more than just losing our mothers. That's right. This book is not about motherless. I mean, there are women in the book who lost their moms because that's my original audience. But no, this book is about for men or women who've lost anyone in the past, with a strong emphasis on losing a parent or sibling or close friend when you're young, because then you are carrying the loss for most of your life. But there are people in here who lost children as well, and some spousal loss. Yeah.
Well, and I think the thing that I think what we tend to do is we tend to take loss and death, loss around death especially, but any kind of loss, and we kind of separate it out. I think it's part of this, kind of progressive, growth-oriented American kind of ethos, that, it's about grow and bigger and faster and wider. And anything's about loss or going backwards or falling apart or anything like that, it doesn't become part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And, life is a series of losses and gains. I mean, that's all there is.
And the ripple effects from any major loss, whether you were young or not. There's a whole there are 3 chapters in here about resurgent grief, which means what are called grief spikes, which is like 15 years later, you may reach a certain transition, big life, major transition in your life, or you may experience another loss, or the 20th anniversary might hit you as really profound because now you've been without your dad longer than you were with him, for example, and you'll have what's called a grief spike. And if you call a bereavement center to say, hey, my dad died and I'm, I'm having a really hard time with it right now. I'm looking for a group or some support. One of the first questions will be, how long ago did he die? And if you say, 17 years, there aren't any services for you. And it's mostly because of funding. And, because a lot of these grief centers really have the funding and the resources to help people get through that most acute phase. Somebody just wrote in the comments, that's where we got left behind after the acute stage. Thank you, Hope, for finding us again. And now I'm going to start crying. Because that's what I needed too. I wrote Motherless Daughters 10, 11 years after my mother died. And now she's been gone for 39 years. And my father's been gone for 16. And I still think of them every day. Well, you too. You lost both of your parents in the past. How long ago was it? Your mom longer than your dad? Yeah.
So my mom was 23 years ago and my dad was 12. And I have to say that this book is such a gift, because in reading this book, it really helped me understand what I was doing, because I want to talk about like forming our own narrative around this stuff. I mean, it's so much of what you talk about.
Yes.
But I really see now, like, because I'm a storyteller and I tell the story of my life, and I just did a memoir and a solo show and all this kind of stuff. And it was all propelled by my mother's death. Me needing to tell my story happened because my mother died, I suddenly knew I have to go on stage and I have to tell my story. And
why was that the precipitating event? Why do you think?
I think because I felt that she never got a chance to tell her story. And so part of it was that. Part of it was that I wanted to
honor her after she dies.
It was a huge way to honor her. Yeah. And that's really why I wrote the book also, was to make sure that her story was told out there. But also because there was something about it that first of all, I knew it was my art form. Like, personal storytelling was what I was put on this planet to do. And when someone dies, you have that, oh, death is real. I think I need to get on with my life kind of a thing, because I've been hemming and hawing. And I think it was a way for me to work through what had happened. My mother was an alcoholic the first 12 years of my life. That was my first loss in life. I lost my mom to alcoholism. She sobered up and survived it. I mean, she barely survived it. She almost died from it. And so I think it was my way of trying to figure out what happened, which is that part you talk about in the book, about the initial thing that people need to do after a loss is to tell their story about what happened.
Right. And this is so interesting, because this is the work of really John Harvey, a social psychologist who taught at the University of Iowa, of all places. Total coincidence, for many, many years. And I had the opportunity to interview him for this book because he has done research. He and his assistants, graduate assistants, did research on how people create stories to get through bereavement. And he talks about story development. The first phase is we are trying to piece together the facts. And if it's a sudden loss or a violent loss, this is a really difficult process, because you may be traumatized by the loss as well, if you were in the accident or witnessed a homicide, for example. But the story development phase is when we are trying to piece together all of the facts in a way that feels intellectually and emotionally complete. And while we're doing that, concurrently, we are often testing our stories, which is why it's really important to talk to people, or we're writing them. I see this in workshops all the time, because I teach nonfiction workshops. I teach memoir, and a lot of people come to write about loss. And that's what they're doing in the memoir workshop sometimes, is they are testing out their narratives. And then we need to confide. And that means that we need to find a compassionate other that we can talk to. It could be a therapist. It could be a partner. It could be, a support group. It could be your writing workshop cohorts. But what I really want to emphasize, and this is so important, is that we create a story, but it's not a fixed artifact. That story can change, and it's okay if it does, and it's even good if it does, because that's how we heal. I've studied narrative therapy, and I'm about to get a second master's. After my master's in nonfiction writing, I'm getting a master's in narrative therapy starting in March. One of the premises of narrative therapy, or what I talk about in this book, is that in terms of a loss, is that the facts remain the same, but our interpretation of those facts is what changes. So look, my mom died in 1981 of breast cancer. I was 17 years old. She was 42. Those are facts I can't change. She was diagnosed 16 months earlier. She had surgery on such and such date. These are immutable facts. Can't change them. Wish I could, can't. Right. But what's changed a lot over the years is my relationship to those facts. This is narrative therapy. My relationship to those facts have changed. They looked one way when I was 17, when I was full of outrage and anger at my father and the doctors and the way that it was handled and the way that I felt she had been mistreated and her disease had been mismanaged. And they looked a different way in my 20s when I started writing Motherless Daughters, and I got her medical records and I interviewed her doctors. They looked different when I became a mother, and I had a whole new grief experience for my mother never getting to know her granddaughter, from my child never knowing her mother, from me not having the help or support or advice or information that I needed at that time. And boy, did those facts look different when I turned 42. Because when I was 17, I was like, well, my mom's 42. She's old. She went to college. She got married. She had children. She did all these things that, I haven't even done yet. And then I turned 42 and I was like, whoa, my mom was really, really young. And then I turned 43 and 44 and 45. So my relationship to those facts is so different now than it was when I was 17. And that's my story changing, because the story we tell ourselves about a loss becomes part of our identity too. I mean, so does any story that we tell ourselves about our lives. But when we have a big event like that, the story we tell ourselves about that event and how it shaped us becomes part of our identity and the whole way that we show up in the world. That makes sense. Yeah, I see you nodding. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I want to drill down in that a little bit too, and just want to mention that I just turned 57, which was the age my mother died. So I'm in that year.
Really? Well, what's that like for you right now? I mean, has your perspective changed?
Yes, I knew she was young anyway at 57. And I feel like in so many ways, I've just finally landed on my feet as an adult. Like in your 50s, you kind of, as I don't know, with women, I think, I don't know if men, but for women,
yeah.
Behind you. And it's terrifying because that was 23 years ago, and that was far away when the year she died. And so, it's weird. It is definitely weird. And
yeah, honey, I'm 16 years. Wait, I'm not that old. I'm 14 years older than my mother got to be. And it is so weird because now I look at my friends who are 42 and they're like my much younger colleagues. Yes. It's so weird to be this much older than my mom. I've had to try to imagine what she'd be like now if she was still alive.
And that's the thing too. It's like, I don't have a role model for what this is supposed to do at 60 or 65 or 70 or 75, which I hope to live into all of those ages. Yeah. And so I feel like it's really uncharted territory to not have that person like, oh, that's what it looks like. And that's what happens to the body. And this happens and all of that. So I feel like I'm on the verge of uncharted territory for my life right now. Absolutely. And I am then, therefore, I am kind of rewriting my story with my relationship with my mom and my loss, because now it's like, I don't know where she doesn't fit into this part because she wasn't here for this part too.
Right. Very much so. But it does give us a certain kind of freedom to invent our own futures. My mom has 2 sisters and I adore them. And so I look to them, for an idea of what I might be like in another 20 years. But it's not the same as having my mom there as the model. And I have 2 daughters, so I am a model to them, and it blows my mind. And they're older now than I was when my mom died. So when my first one turned 17, I felt like I was falling off a cliff. How am I going to raise a kid beyond 17? And I had all this anxiety, like I'm not going to know what to do. I'm going to make all these mistakes. And then I thought, okay, just calm down. First of all, I've lived with her for 17 years. Like we have a relationship. I know who she is. We know how to relate to each other for better or worse, but almost always for the better. But I did have this moment where I thought, you know what? I don't know that being a 17-year-old in 1981 with my mom would even give me that much guidance for being a mother to a 17-year-old, because everything's different. The rules of engagement are different. I'll tell you, social media makes all the difference in the world. Now I have an 18-year-old in college, and we text and FaceTime all the time. But remember, when we went to college, you would talk to your parents once a week on a Sunday because rates went down. And right, and you pull the phone out into the hall, and so we're making new rules all the time as parents now. So it's just another occasion to miss my mom and wish that she'd been there. But I think I'm romanticizing how useful that model would have been for me today as a mom.
Yeah, and I think the broader point is that these are kind of the touchstones along the way where the loss becomes a chance. It shows up again, and it's like, okay, how do I rework my relationship with it and the meaning that I'm giving it? Right. And and all of that. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating, and that I'm going to use because I love that this book landed in my lap this last week, because I'm getting ready to start to write again. And I want to write about the last 12 years of my life since my dad's death, because my memoir, my solo show went up to my dad's death. And about 3 years ago, I too tried to write a book and tried for a whole year and was not ready and put it aside and all of that. it was going to be called Untangling Daughterhood, and you and I talked a lot about this.
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
But there's something that you talk about in Aftergrief that is so helpful for us who are dealing with long-term loss, which is where to put the loss. There's this before story and there's the after story. And I know I do it, and it's totally natural to do it, which is, there was Kelly before my mom died and Kelly after my mom died. And there was Kelly before my dad died and Kelly after my dad died.
Right.
And there's this thing that happens where you cut off your relationship with yourself when you do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you go and you
life story.
And so I'm just really curious about how you saw this and came up with this, and why is it important to try to bridge these things?
Well, I heard it over and over again from the women who were coming to the retreat saying, I feel like my life was split into a before and after. And I thought, wow, that creates a really fractured life narrative. You have a story of before and a story of after. And if any of you out there have not yet seen the interview that Anderson Cooper did with Stephen Colbert August of last year, I highly recommend looking it up online, because Anderson Cooper they both talk about this. Anderson Cooper says this exactly. He says, it's like, the coming of Pol Pot, my life, there was a before and an after. And Stephen Colbert says something that's just breathtaking in this interview, which relates to something that you just said earlier. Because his dad and both of his brothers died in a plane crash when he was 10 years old, a commercial aviation accident. He said that he's had to learn to love the thing he most wishes had not happened. And that to me is actually a really terrific description of resilience and the aftergrief, because I can look back now and I can say, wow, a lot of good things in my life came about because I had this major loss when I was a teenager. And I don't play the game like, oh, I wish that my mom, I would give it all up to have my mom back. Because, I'm never going to get that choice. That's not an option.
Right.
That's
right.
just
it's not a real choice.
People play, right? But you're asking about the before and after. So I heard a lot of people saying that. And then I heard people with other forms of losses, especially when they were younger. And when you have a fractured life narrative like that, I respect, it feels like you may have had a certain kind of worldview and an assumptive world and a way of being in the world that could no longer continue after that person was removed from your family or your life. I get that. Yes, we do have before and after. But I help people see the overarching narrative of their whole life. Where's the continuity? Because if we think of ourselves in having a fractured life narrative, then we don't have a continuous life story. It's really important for us to tease out, well, what did persist, despite the fact that we feel like our story got cleaved, at a certain point. Who did you come into the world to be, and who are you still? And who would you have been? What elements or qualities of, of your personality or your temperament were so baked into your DNA that even a major loss wasn't going to damage it or take it away? And I've watched over and over rooms full of women just like get this sense of relief, like I can connect with like my essential self, like who I really am. That's still there. That didn't get taken away from me, but maybe I've had to suppress it because I had to develop coping and survival skills in the aftermath of a major loss that minimized these other parts of me. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so much of the work I do with women and women on the verge is about helping them reclaim aspects of themselves that they put away in the basement, I say in the basement of your psyche, in order to serve, usually it's chaos or trauma, or sometimes it's a loss, or sometimes it's just, being, growing up a woman in our culture. Sometimes it's, that. But I think there is ways in which these young parts of ourselves decide, well, this is this, and it will no longer happen that way because I need to shore up these other parts of my personality in order to survive this. And yeah, it's so interesting. One of the things I loved about what you were talking about was this idea of contamination versus redemptive narratives.
Oh, yeah. That's the work of a psychologist at Northwestern University. Yes, Stories We Live By is one of the resources. It's a terrific book. Yeah, it looks at how we tell our life stories. And the redemption narrative is the story that is culturally preferable. You know, it's the hero's journey. It's the story that goes from a negative state to a positive one. What he calls a contamination narrative is the story that goes from an idyllic childhood to a difficult adulthood. In fact, we are all the product of many, many stories. Like I could tell you the story of having been a wife. I could tell you the story of being a mother. I could tell you the story of being a daughter. I could tell you the story of being a writer, in which Iowa City factors prominently over and over again. But, you know, some of those would be stories that I might tell in a redemptive fashion, and some might be others that I would tell in a contamination fashion. But the healing process tends to, people tend to have better physical health and better mental health when they are able to create redemptive narratives or see their stories as redemptive. Now, we don't want to just put a positive spin on the story, but the work that I do with clients is, okay, you have a story of tragedy and suffering. That's a real story. I'm not going to try to take that away from you. But since we are all, the compilation of many stories, let's find another narrative in there that's equally true, an alternate narrative that is equally true that you can carry side by side with that contamination narrative. Let's find you some redemptive narratives. Let's emphasize them or bring them into the picture so they can coexist with the contamination narratives, and that will balance it out a little bit so that you don't feel that your whole life went from good to bad, for example. That's a very reductive way of describing it, but this is really important work. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it really does tie in and weave into this idea of standing back from our narrative, whether it's the segmented one of the before and after, or the victim hero, like whatever spin you want to put on it, but to just stand back. And I love that work that you do in the book and you invite us to do, which is, what is the larger picture? Who are you on both sides of the narrative, on the before and the after, and who is your essential self? I think it's because we do get so locked into our stories and our narratives around it, and a loss, because especially when you're young and you have a loss, and you talk a lot with your former clients and interview a lot of people where that loss just upended their whole life. I mean, it upended your life, And
I work with a lot of people who were young when both parents died, and that turns a child's life completely upside down, right? Absolutely. They typically lose their home, their school, their friends. Everything changes. Everything, rug completely pulled out from under them. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions here. Let's go in. Let's go into some questions here. All right. Laura Joyce Hubbard asks, hi, Hope, can you please give us a little more insight into rewriting those first 120 pages?
Did
the content keep shifting, or the form, or both? Was your rewriting completely a product of the political environment / fallout, or what made the last 240 pages flow more easily? Thank you for this gorgeous book.
Oh, Laura took one of my Iowa Summer Writing Festival classes. Hi, Laura. I think I was rewriting those first 120 pages because I didn't know what book I was writing, and I needed to keep busy and feel like I was still a writer and doing something. And it was really hard to get them in place. Like, I rewrote the introduction. It went through so many different iterations, but the first 120 pages take us through the introduction, chapter 1, which is the history, the story of grief. Chapter 2, which is about the relational model of grief, but also cultural relativity, and then moves us into talking about new grief, what I call new grief, and new old grief. Old grief and new old grief being part of the aftergrief, what comes over time. But I kept rewriting them and sending them back to my editor over and over again. And at a certain point, he was like, I need some new material. And I think it was because I didn't really have a sense of what book I was writing, so I was keeping busy, in other words. What helped me write the rest of it was, the pandemic. I just brought I'm in my office right now in Topanga, but I took everything I needed from my office and brought it home because it was just me and my 18-year-old daughter during the pandemic, and I didn't want to come to my office every day. I mean, it's just me in a room, so there's no one else around. But I put everything on the dining room table, mountains of source material, files and books and transcripts and articles. And I just sat there and, day after day, I wrote this book. And I had a friend who emailed me every morning and say, what are you writing about today? And I would, start in the email, writing the chapter basically, and I would unplug sections of the email and put it into the book. And that helped because it removed me from feeling like I have to impress all the PhDs, or sound like an academic, because I was just writing to a friend who happened to be a member of the audience. He was a reader for the book. So that helped a lot. And then so it was the pandemic. It was being afraid my contract was going to be canceled. That lights a fire under your butt if you think you might have to pay back the money that you've already spent. Seriously, I mean, I'm being really transparent and honest about that. But what was so funny is when Kirkus Review published their review. Kirkus, for those of you who don't know, is one of the earliest reviews you get. It's within the book industry. Kirkus said something about how the 120 pages or so, like so solid. And I immediately, sent it to my editor and said, ha ha, if only they knew how many times I had to rewrite those 120 pages. But I felt like at least it's validation for all the time and effort I put into them.
Yeah. I'm so curious about what is it? I mean, I know it's about this personal loss you had, but what is it about the conversation around grief that is so important and so just baked into your purpose and DNA? I just have always been so curious about that.
Personally, or what I think about others?
No, just what you're still at it, girl. You're still having this conversation with us.
I gotta say, people say, man, that must be so heavy. That must be so heavy. How do you do that every day? And I say, you have no idea like how much laughter happens. Like you came to one of my retreats as a guest. I see women in the chat over here who've been to the retreats. I mean, we all share the same dark humor. And there's a lot of laughter that occurs at these retreats and in the work that I do, because we have to balance the gravity with some levity. We just have to. I mean, you know a million comedians, that a lot of them have really, really sad stories, and they develop the humor muscle as a way of coping with all of that sadness or tragedy in their past. But I'm still at it all these years later. I don't know. I think my purpose here, Kelly, is to reduce human suffering and to be of service to other people. So that's what I do. I don't know how to do anything else. And that comes from my mom, because she was a professional volunteer. She was so altruistic. And I'm still at it. But, I work with co-facilitators at the retreats. And when I'm often training a new facilitator and she's there for the first time, I tell her the first day is really intense, because a lot of these women at the retreats were not allowed to, they were never given permission to grieve or talk about their mom. And what we do the very first morning for half the day is everybody gets 5 minutes to speak. And we call it story witnessing. And the prompt is, I've been waiting a long time to talk about. And then whatever it is that you've been holding in that you have not had a safe place or had permission to talk about, you got 5 minutes, sister, with an iPhone timer. If you go 30 seconds over, it's not a big deal. But you got all that time to just, externalize whatever you've been holding in that feels, like you don't want to hold on to it anymore. You can put it out there in the world, and people will receive it with curiosity and compassion and without judgment. And so there's so much relief after that. So I tell, and sometimes when I'm training a new facilitator, they'll say, oh my God, like after that session, right? We'll have the lunch break. They'll be like, whoa, I did not know this was going to be so heavy. And I say, just wait though, wait until Sunday afternoon. This is how I can do it 13 retreats I've done so far. It's how I do it, because the arc these women travel, where they are on Sunday afternoon when they leave, it's worlds away from where they were Friday morning when they're releasing all of this. It's so beautiful. So how do I keep doing this? I keep doing this because of Sunday afternoon, because I know what Sunday afternoon is going to be like. And I know that you have to get through Friday morning to get to Sunday afternoon.
Amen, sister. I think that's just overall in life. That's
pretty much
our new motto.
Pretty much.
To get through Friday, you have to get to Sunday.
If you want to go and collect $200, you got to get past Park Place and Boardwalk with all the hotels on it. Yes, you do.
Exactly. All right. Here's some more questions. Fantastic. I'm so excited we have more questions. This is from Paisley Megan. Hi, Hope. I don't know if you saw my message in the chat, but I met you in the summer of 2016 when I was a Medill cherub.
Medill cherub at Northwestern. Yeah. Oh, hi, Paisley.
She says, great to see you again. How do you think the process of grief will evolve with COVID? Do you think it will evolve?
Oh, that's so important. I'm being asked this a lot in interviews for this book. Like, what do I think about COVID? Because we are having a 100-year cycle with COVID, right? And what I say is in 1918 and 19, during the last big pandemic in this country, the flu pandemic, we lost a lot of our mourning rituals and we suffered for it. So we cannot afford to lose them now. We have to hold on to it. We have to maintain the social component of grief. It's so important. That's what we're losing now because we can't gather. We can't honor and memorialize our dead together. So people have said to me, so died, and, I may not be able to have the memorial service for a year. And I'm so sad because I think we may not ever have it. And I say, no, you can have it. Have it in a year, have it in 2 years, have it in 5 years. Where is the law that says we can only do the memorial service, right? We attach it to the burial because it's, for one thing, it's convenient and because it helps the mourners, but we can do it at any time. One thing I do think about COVID, actually, and this is a plus, if we think of it this way, are the Zoom funerals. I mean, they're terrible for all of us who can and would be there. They're a very poor substitute. Yeah. But I hope they will continue in a hybrid form. We still need to gather in person again when we can. But it is a way for people who can't travel on short notice or can't leave their jobs or can't leave their children to still be part of the
ritual.
And that's really great important for them. Mm-hmm. So I hope we will see hybrid funerals and memorials in the future.
I love that. I absolutely love that. It's like it'll be an addition to, it'll be a part of the new tradition is what it'll be.
Right after the pandemic started, I was part of a task force. There were about 90 people. We were authors, activists, academics who all work in the bereavement field. And we all got together. Michael Hess of Death Over Dinner brought us together. And now he has an end of life collective. He's very active in this field. He's a real connector. He brought 90 people together. We were doing Zoom calls maybe 2-3 times a month, and just sharing what we were all doing to try to help people cope with COVID and all the death that was happening and that we knew was coming, and the mourning issues that we knew were going to arise as a result. And we started sharing and cross-pollinating and creating new initiatives together. So that's been a very positive outcome. That is one way that COVID is going to change mourning behavior. It's also helping us have a much greater appreciation as well for different cultural traditions. And for example, because COVID is hitting communities of color harder than white communities, we're learning about the needs of those communities in terms of death, dying, and bereavement, and how they are different from the dominant white culture, so that we can help meet those needs moving forward.
Yeah, there was a question here, which I think you might have answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway to make sure, from Emery. I just spoke at a funeral where my stories were broadcast and more questions were passed to us remotely. Can you tell us more about the changes with the Spanish flu epidemic versus what you're seeing now with mourning changing in COVID? I think in general, we kind of answered that, but it is...
And of course, we didn't have Zoom in 1918 or 19. We also didn't have international travel, which meant it took longer for that virus to spread, though it was an incredibly virulent strain of the flu. It was so virulent that there are stories of people getting on a subway in New York and dying before they got off. Or like whole families dying within hours. I mean, wow. Yeah. God, we are not there now. Yeah, I mean, we have technology now, and we have, we'll develop a vaccine quicker, I think, than, we got one in 1918 to 19, of course. So there's, all the technological advances make it very different. But in the end, a virus still replicates and still gets passed from person to person in 2020 exactly the same way it did in 1918. It's kind of impervious to human development and technological prowess. So I find that kind of remarkable. When we look at that it's getting us the same way it got us in 1918. And the most effective deterrents to this virus are exactly what people were told to do in 1918.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cover your mouth and wash your hands.
Well, and I also think of that, we have had 100 years of therapy in this culture. And so there is, even though, men and women grieve differently and, there's still some stigma around it. There are, grief centers, and grief is a topic, and, your book, and you know what I mean? It's like there is at least more conversation about grief in general.
There's more conversation, and there are terrific programs and support services for people who have the resources, either, whether it's financial for private therapy or they have coverage through insurance and a job, or they're able to get themselves, through transportation to a bereavement center. There are lots and lots of cities that don't have bereavement centers, but there's still a lot of people who are grieving alone, and especially now during the pandemic. And that I worry about the people. I worry about the people that are socially isolated for health reasons and are grieving alone, because I don't think we were ever meant to grieve alone. I think it really, for millennia, it was a communal collective experience. I don't think that, millennia of humans got it wrong. I think it's more likely that, Western society got it wrong in the past 100 years. And I mean Western society because there are other indigenous and tribal societies over the past 100 years that have been performing their regular and long-standing and ancestral grief rituals and traditions that have helped them, that are very, very different from the way we handle it here.
Yeah, there's a great book written by Malidome Some about the rituals of Burkina Faso. And
the Dagara tribe. The Dagara tribe.
Incredible story of his father's death and the ritual and the experience of how they work with their ancestors after they're dead. And I mean, it's incredibly powerful. Yeah,
that's my favorite cultural tradition. It's the Dagara tribe of Dagara tribe of Burkina Faso, and his late wife, Sobonfu Some, has also written and lectured and used to lecture widely about grief. The mourning practices of any culture tend to be based on their belief systems, and the Somes tribe in Burkina Faso has a different belief system about death and the afterlife. But they also believe that we need that mental and physical hygiene depends on us releasing our grief, that it has to be externalized. And so on their tribal lands in Africa, almost every day, someone's got a grief ritual going on where you can just show up and you can scream and cry or, pound on the earth.
God, we need that right now.
And the community will hold you. The community will give you that space, that containment. Whether you lost your job or your best friend stopped talking to you or your grandmother just died or you're getting divorced, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be a death. Any kind of grief that you need to express, they believe also needs to be done in community. And I agree. I think so too.
Someone asks here just about the psychological impacts of Westerners suppressing grief. What have you found in your research about that? Like, what are some of the side effects of that?
Well, there are clear physiological effects. We know that it can affect the cardiovascular system, that the stress of not speaking can create inflammation. The work of James.
Oh, that's right. You write about that, the galvanic skin response.
Yeah.
The person telling their story and the stress going down. Yes.
Yeah. The work of James Pennebaker at University of Texas in Austin. Fascinating. And this might be interesting for writers too, because he studied what's called expressive writing. And he had students who were the subjects of his studies at first come and write just for 15 minutes a day for like 4 times. And there was no science to that. Like, that's the amount of time he got the research room or classroom.
Right.
Which is really funny. But they came for 15 minutes and he separated into the group of subjects and controls. And so the subjects came and they were encouraged to write for 15 minutes about the most traumatic experience they had had up to that point. And the control group just wrote about something completely neutral, like their shoes. And then he asked them questions to see, how they responded to that and how they were doing psychologically afterwards. But he was also looking at how often they were visiting the student health center and how, their self-reporting of illnesses. And he found that the students in the expressive writing group were physically healthier after this study. It was fascinating. But then he did more studies, and other people started replicating the studies, and they found that if you just came and vented your emotions on the page, you actually felt worse, not better. And if you just wrote episodically about what happened, which is the typical first draft of a memoir, this happened and that happened, this happened and that happened, those people didn't feel much better either. But those who combined the emotion and the detail, who wrote what they thought about how they felt and how they felt about what happened, had the biggest benefits. He also did skin conductivity tests and found with a former grad student, I believe it was, who on the anniversary of her parents' death, and he found that when she talked about her parents and their death, her stress level went down, not up. See, we think it's going to make people upset to talk about it. But she needed and wanted to talk about it. And so did her body, because when she talked about their death on that anniversary, her stress levels went down on the skin conductivity scale. And when she was asked to talk about something else, her stress levels went up because she was suppressing the thing that she really wanted to talk about. The longer term effects, like the adverse childhood experience studies in particular, show us that when we've had a trauma and we don't have a chance to process it, to talk about it, to work through it, it does show up in different ways. It can show up as depression, as anger, as violence, in children as behavioral problems. It can show up in cardiovascular problems. It can show up in certain kinds of cancer.
Addiction, certainly.
Addiction, yes, self-medication. Yeah, exactly. Substance and abuse.
So we have two more questions here.
Okay.
Tricia just wants to know, is there a resource list or link for that? I think in the book there is, she's got a wonderful, in the back, she has a bibliography with all that kind of stuff. A note section. Someone says, hi, looking forward to have you at the Lawrence Public Library event soon.
Oh, yes, hello.
And just wants to know, how do you think about your work versus Kubler-Ross's work on grief?
I think Kubler-Ross was a brilliant star in this field. I think the work that she did on death and dying was absolutely groundbreaking. I've watched videos of her, you can find them on YouTube, in the 1970s, where she just becomes apoplectic because she never intended for these stages of dying to become stages of grief. So I think of her as one of the foremothers, of this work. I don't think in fact, the what is it? At the very beginning, it's the epigraph to the book, right? Is a quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It says, the loss happens in time, in fact, in a moment, but its aftermath lasts a lifetime. She knew that. And her work evolved too. I mean, her work evolved greatly over the years into her later books, like The Wheel of Life, for example. So I think she was brilliant. I don't know that I could be doing the work that I'm doing if she hadn't started us all along.
I mean, such a pioneer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then one last comment here from Kay. She says, so much of your book resonates with me. Cumulative grief, cyclical grief, sneak attacks. But I really loved when you talked about beginning a new relationship with the loved one you lost. Can you speak more about that? Well, Kay, I'm just going to say something. You have to buy the book. Because this whole thing is about that. It so sounds powerful. Like you read it. And it's you lay it all out, and you lay out what I love about what you do, Hope, is you lay the right brain and the left brain out. You do both stuff. You're like, here's the research, here's the way to think about it, here's the kind of this more academic way, and then here's the emotional reality behind it, because you include your story and the story of these women and so many other people, and you really give a beautiful invitation for all of us to step into, to reinvent our story with the loss, and to also see all the sneaky ways. I love the sneak attacks, because it is so true. I mean, I just I'm doing a documentary about my dad right now, so I just opened up 2 trunks and had to go through it, and every time I open up the trunks, comes walking into the room, and I leave my body half the time, but this time I didn't. I was just with it all very differently. I found a diary of my mother's from 1962, the year before I was born, and I integrated a version of my mother into my present life this week, that I was really ready to integrate, and welcomed her in, and love this version of Brenda Carlin that I got to meet this week. And she's now walking with me, you know, she's this, you know, my mom has changed a little bit now because of it. So
that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
To answer Kay's question, that's where grief theory went in the 1990s. It's just taking longer, you know, to sort of disperse among, you know, the entire culture. But that's called the relational model of grief. And the idea is, no, we're not supposed to let go of the people we love. That was causing more pain than solace. And, you know, a number of psychologists discovered that, and social workers discovered that their clients were having a lot of trouble letting go because they didn't want to, because they still loved that person. They needed to find a new and different way to love them and walk with them moving forward. And so the book talks a lot about that. So I do want to say, please buy the book from Prairie Lights, support your local independent bookseller. But I'm doing a free event on Sunday. If you like this, we're going to go much deeper on Sunday. It's just at theaftergrief.com, but I'm going to do a book giveaway. So if you register for the live event, you'll automatically be entered in a drawing, and we're going to do 3 copies in a giveaway. So you might be able to get one that way too. But make that one a gift and buy one from Prairie Lights, because Prairie Lights is my favorite bookstore in the world. I have never launched a book without doing a Prairie Lights event. And again, it breaks my heart to not be there in person. Kelly, I wish we could have done this together in person over there. We would have had so
I know.
I'm so glad to do it with you here and just see you. I mean, you're only on the other side of Los Angeles, but we haven't seen each other since February.
Yeah, absolutely. There are 2 more questions that popped up, and I just want to honor these questions just because I just want these people to be seen and heard. I think it's important. I think that's what you and I are all about anyway. So Viv asks, and then we'll be done with the questions. Could you talk a little bit more about the importance and impact of confiding our stories of loss?
Yes. Well, there's a huge section in here that's called People We Need to Talk and Paint and Dance and et cetera, et cetera. It's just a way of externalizing. I mean, not everybody's a talker, and not everybody has somebody that they can confide in. So sometimes writing your story down and sharing it with others is a way of confiding. But it seems all the research points to that we need to be able to share our story, and that when we don't, we do have that, you know, kind of inner stress level that starts developing. So I would, you know, I hate to refer you just to the book and not talk about it now, but I know we have to wrap up in just a minute. But there's a whole chapter on that and how important confiding is, because it not only allows us to have a human connection, but it allows someone else on the other side to exercise sympathy and to be altruistic. So it's a reflexive relationship that develops, and it helps both parties. So it's not just important to the teller, it's also important to the listener.
So true. I mean, I think about my urge was to get on a stage to tell my story.
Yeah, that's not something that I would.
And I'm really glad I did. And my story, telling my story helps others. I know it does, because everyone has some kind of loss in their life. And that's always touches me when people come around or email me and say, you know, the loss of your mother really touched me, and here's my lost story. Because that's what we do. Last question from Jim Crowley. Jim asks, if a loved one is dealing with grief and you can see the depth of their suffering, but they cannot, how do you gently nudge them in the direction of getting help?
Well, I think first you let them know that you are there for them, you know, and that you can handle and hold space for them to talk. I think sometimes it's just really, you know, doing it gently and with compassion, you know, hey, I see you're really struggling. And I think that some kind of outside or professional help might really aid you, because here's what I say, and you can quote me on this if you want, which is that grief is a lifelong process, but it doesn't have to be a lifelong struggle. And if you see someone really struggling for a long time, they might be experiencing what's called complicated grief, which about 15% of the population is believed to experience after someone dies. Most of these people are thought to have had pre-existing anxiety or conditions or depression. But nonetheless, about 15% of people do need professional assistance because their grief becomes complicated by other factors. So you might just educate them about that and let them know, hey, 15% of people who suffer a loss have a harder time than the rest of the population. There's no shame to that. 15% is a pretty big percentage. And there are people out there who are trained to help you if you're in that 15%. So, here's some resources, and just, be there, and people will avail themselves of it when they feel ready. So, you might, if they don't avail themselves, then you might revisit it, in a couple of weeks or a couple of months and feel it out. Depends on your relationship with them.
Yeah. So, thank you again, Hope, for letting me be the part of this conversation with you. And one of the things, the quotes that I used at my mother's memorial, which was a huge transformative moment in my life and is part of my life story that I tell, was I talk about this Joseph Campbell quote because my mother personified it so beautifully, which was, my mother knew how to joyfully participate in the sorrows of the world. And I really feel like your work, Hope, really helps all of us, because there are sorrows in the world. We can't pretend, we can't turn away from it. And we do have to learn how to joyfully participate in all of this. And the ending of your book is so beautiful in how you walk us through that and holding the tension of these opposites. So it's just an honor to walk this path with you, and an honor to be here at the birth of your book. And congratulations. And thank you for the work you do in the world. Really, thank you.
And to right back at you, darling, you do fantastic work in everything that you do. And it is an honor to know you and be your friend and to be here with you today. And thank you to everyone who took time out of your day, your evening, or your night, if you're on the East Coast, to be here with us. I hope to see you again, either on Sunday at the live event or somewhere else, or in Iowa City next summer. I'm usually there every July.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. And you guys have a great evening. Thank you, John, for hosting this.
Thank you.
And everyone stay safe.
Yes, thank you. And Prairie Lights and the UNESCO City of Literature program. Thank you both.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again, Hope and Kelly. It was a wonderful conversation. I wish we could keep going, but I know that you have things to do and other events to be preparing for. For folks who maybe tuned in late, the video for this event will be on this website and accessible in just a few moments. You could watch the whole thing. You can also send that link to friends and others who you think would benefit from hearing it. So thank you again. We do have one more book festival event coming up on October 26th with Marilyn Robinson, who will be joined by Lan Samantha Cheng, director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, to talk about Marilyn Robinson's new book, Jack. And of course, we have many other events that you can look at on the iowicitybookfestival.org. And as Hope had said, be sure to check out the website with Prairie Lights to pick up a copy of her book or books from other authors at the festival as well. You can click that handy green button at the bottom that says buy the book, and it will take you directly there. Otherwise, you can visit Prairie Lights online through other means. So thank you again for visiting with us this evening, and we will bring our event to a close. Thank you.